On October 1st, 1946, this man will climb the gallows. But the path to the noose began much earlier. Hans Michael Frank entered the world on May 23, 1900, in the city of Karlsruhe. 36 years later, he will be known as the Butcher of Poland. For now, he is a victim of family collapse. His mother packs a leather suitcase. The latch clicks shut in the hallway. 10-year-old Hans stands in the doorway. He watches her leave for a lover in Prague. The house grows silent. The trauma of the abandoned child would later fuel the cruelty of the mass murderer. Did trauma create the tyrant? The answer lies in the streets of Munich. The city roared with the sound of post-war riots. Revolution convulsed Germany. Frank needed a family. He found it in the Freikorps. These paramilitary units crushed socialist uprisings with savage efficiency. Boots hammered the pavement. Rifles fired into crowds. For Frank, the Freikorps was the father he never had. But he sought more than just violence. He joined the Thule Society. This was no mass movement. It was an elite club of just 250 people in Munich. The air in their meeting rooms smelled of old paper and occult theories. This mystical organization spawned the German Workers' Party. It was the precursor to the Nazi movement. In 1919, Hans Frank officially joined the party. The street fighter traded his brass knuckles for a briefcase. He became the movement's legal shield. By 1923, Hans Frank served as Adolf Hitler's personal attorney. He was a master of the system. Frank defended Nazi interests in over 2,400 court cases. One prophetic lawyer issued a warning: political movements that begin in criminal courts will end in criminal courts. Frank ignored the omen. In 1925, he married Brigitte Herbst. It was a merger of cold ambition. The lawyer, who had defended the law in 2,400 trials, now began to dismantle it for a single party. This was the ultimate contrast: a jurist killing justice. Brigitte demanded status. Frank promised her a throne. In 1939, Hitler appointed him Governor General of occupied Poland. 12 million people became his subjects. The couple moved into Wawel Castle in Krakow. Since the 11th century, this fortress served as the residence of Polish kings. Frank intended to stay. He stood in the ancient halls and looked at his wife. Then, he knelt before her. He proclaimed Brigitte the Queen of Poland. He immediately began the systematic orchestration of genocide from the royal chambers. Hans Frank knelt before his wife. If he had to print posters for every 7 Poles shot, the forests of Poland would not be enough to make the paper. Hans Frank said this in Prague. He was a lawyer. He understood the value of a signed confession. The halls of Wawel Castle became a logistics center for industrial slaughter. Polish kings once walked here. Now, Frank hung Lady with an Ermine by Leonardo da Vinci on his office wall. Outside the window, the rhythm of the Reich took over. Steam from the locomotives clouded the glass. Trains moved day and night. 4 million people lived under his jurisdiction. That was the entire population of Ireland in 1939. How does one justify 4 million deaths? Frank turned murder into a filing system. The Butcher of Poland sat at a mahogany desk. He signed documents. Red posters appeared on the gray walls of Krakow. They announced executions. 7 Czechs died for 1 poster. 7 Poles were not worth the ink. The numbers are absolute. 3 million Jews moved through his transport schedules toward the gas chambers. Another million Poles followed. While the ghettos starved, Frank hosted banquets. He stole art worth millions. He lived as a king in a graveyard of his own making. Evidence did not scare him. He kept a personal diary. It spanned 38 volumes. Every order and every death was recorded in his own hand. Those 38 volumes of the personal diary became the primary evidence for the prosecution in 1946. The transition was absolute. The King of Poland vanished. In his place sat a defendant in a cheap suit. Hans Frank spent his final months in a cell. The butcher traded his palace for a narrow cot. He claimed to be a devout Catholic. He prayed, he repented. But the facade of a holy man failed to mask the smell of the gallows. Did he truly find God? No, he found fear. The International Military Tribunal reached its verdict on October 1, 1946. Nuremberg was silent. Frank stood in the dock. The court held him responsible for 4 million souls. The sentence was death by hanging. He returned to his cell. He waited for the heavy footsteps in the corridor. He waited for the rope. Hans Frank remained in his cell until October 16, 1946. After the gallows, only the archives remained. The physical traces of the King of Poland dissolved, but the paper trail of his crimes stayed behind. Thousands of pages of stolen art ledgers and personal confessions wait in the vaults. These documents are not easily accessed. Why does the truth remain buried? Digital algorithms often suppress uncomfortable history. They filter out the darkness that mainstream platforms prefer to ignore. Accessing these secrets requires more than a casual search. Veiled history operates as a digital archive. We track the movements of stolen millions and the final words of war criminals. Every new subscriber strengthens this search. 100,000 people, that is the target. 100,000 is the exact number of lives erased in a single district under Frank's administration. Reaching this number ensures these stories survive the censors. We have 3 more execution records scheduled for release this month. Number of upcoming files: 3. The gallows at Nuremberg required more than witnesses. They required proof. Hans Frank provided it himself. 43 volumes, thousands of pages, a meticulous record of systematic murder. Why keep such a ledger? Frank believed his bureaucratic conflicts with other Nazi officials would exonerate him. He surrendered the diaries voluntarily. He expected the Allies to see a misunderstood administrator. The strategy backfired. Prosecutors found a detailed roadmap of genocide. One entry stands out for its cold precision. Frank wrote that officials must annihilate the Jews wherever they are found. His own ink sealed his fate. The text proved direct involvement in the Holocaust. Beyond the crimes, the pages revealed a fractured psychology. Frank saw himself as a man of culture. He believed he was bringing civilization to Poland. While he wrote about Chopin and law, he signed orders for mass executions. The delusion remained intact until the end. 100,000 subscribers now follow this investigation into the archives. This number matches the population of entire cities Frank erased from the map. Algorithms often bury these uncomfortable truths. History requires active retrieval. Accessing these files is the only way to prevent the veil from closing. 100,000. 100,000 files documented the transition from law to slaughter. Hans Frank exchanged his legal robes for the uniform of a colonial executioner. His masterpiece of administrative terror stood in the heart of Poland, the Warsaw Ghetto. Frank established this enclosure in October 1940. He crammed 400,000 Jewish souls into 1.3 square miles. 10-foot stone walls rose overnight. Barbed wire crowned the perimeter. Inside, the math of genocide began. An average of 7.2 people shared every single room. Did Frank view this as a logistical failure? No. He viewed it as a biological weapon. He personally authorized the rations. A German resident received 2,613 calories a day. A Jewish resident received 184. Hunger became the primary administrative tool. Starvation stripped the flesh from the living before disease finished the work. By 1941, bodies covered with scrap newspapers became the ghetto's only pavement. The strategy functioned with lethal precision. Between 1940 and 1942, 83,000 people died without a single shot being fired. Frank's own commissar recorded the data with cold pride. The reports noted a quantum leap in mortality for May. The food shortage had successfully evolved into a famine. This was not incompetence or the chaos of war. Frank signed the orders for every calorie denied. Between 1940 and 1942, he oversaw the systematic extinction of 83,000 victims. Frank did not just starve cities, he dismantled a civilization. Administration served as a facade for systematic plunder. The Governor General viewed Poland as a warehouse. He took what he wanted. Did he value art? No. He valued the status of a conqueror. Leonardo da Vinci painted only 15 portraits in his lifetime. One of them, Lady with an Ermine, ended up in Frank's office. It hung on the walls of Wawel Castle. A stolen masterpiece served as a personal trophy. He added Rembrandt's landscape with the Good Samaritan to his private collection. Thousands of other works vanished from Polish museums. By January 1945, the Red Army approached. Frank prepared to flee. He did not leave empty-handed. 3 heavy trucks stood in the castle courtyard. Soldiers loaded them with gold, jewelry, and canvases. The cargo was worth tens of millions of dollars. The convoy moved west through the snow. Amidst the chaos of the retreat, one painting vanished. Raphael's portrait of a young man disappeared near the Silesian border. To this day, the frame remains empty. It is the most valuable piece of art lost during the Second World War. The empty frame in the Wawel Castle was only the beginning. Hans Frank did not just steal art. He attempted to erase Polish civilization entirely. His logic was simple. He believed he was preserving culture for a superior race by destroying the people who created it. This twisted rationalization would later form his entire defense at Nuremberg. But behind the facade of Nazi respectability, the Frank family harbored secrets that rotted them from within. How did his wife Brigitte contribute to the family fortune? She drove her Mercedes-Benz directly into the Jewish ghettos. She didn't go to govern, she went to shop at gunpoint. Brigitte targeted terrified families, stripping them of jewelry and furs. Her son, Nicholas Frank, later revealed the brutal market dynamics. The Jews were forced to sell everything at any price his mother dictated. It was not trade, it was state-sanctioned robbery. The Frank children lived a surreal nightmare. Their nanny regularly took young Nicholas to nearby concentration camps. For entertainment, guards forced starving prisoners to ride donkeys while the children watched. It was a playground built on agony. The family's weekend castle sat near the main railway lines. Every day, cattle cars packed with human cargo rattled past their windows. The destination was Auschwitz. The Frank family watched the trains pass and chose to see nothing. Frank's sister operated her own depraved machine. She met incoming Jewish prisoners at the camps with a specific offer. She promised survival in exchange for diamonds. Once the stones changed hands, she abandoned them to the gas chambers. By the time the war turned, the Frank family had accumulated a fortune soaked in blood. Bridget Frank stole furs from families who would be dead within 48 hours. 3 trucks loaded with masterpieces by Rembrandt, Raphael, and Leonardo da Vinci sped away from Krakow. The King of Poland was retreating. Hans Frank abandoned his subjects to the Soviet advance while securing a fortune in stolen canvas and gold. By 1942, the butcher's throne began to crack. He clashed with Heinrich Himmler. The SS wanted total control over the killing machine Frank helped build. His personal life collapsed in tandem. Frank sought a divorce to marry his childhood sweetheart, Lily Grodel. Brigitte Frank struck back with lethal precision. She denounced her husband's mistress to the SS, falsely claiming Grodel was Jewish. The move worked. Hitler intervened, banning Frank from public speaking and stripping his Reich positions. Yet, he remained trapped in his Polish kingdom of death. Frank later claimed he submitted 14 resignation requests. The documents suggest otherwise. He refused to surrender absolute power until the very end. In January 1945, the facade vanished. Frank fled toward Bavaria. He carried a forged passport under the name Pfizer. On May 4, 1945, soldiers from the United States 7th Army, many of whom had just liberated Dachau, tracked him down near Tegernsee. They found no king. They found a man in a civilian coat cowering in a hut. The soldiers forced him to walk a corridor of shame through a line of troops. The man who once ruled millions with an iron fist attempted to end his own life twice within 48 hours. 3 trucks, loaded with masterpieces by Rembrandt, Raphael, and Da Vinci, departed Krakow. These heavy vehicles carried treasures worth millions of Reichsmarks. Art looted from Polish museums and private collections filled the cargo beds. Outside, Germany lay in ruins. Inside, the King of Poland sat with a forged passport in the name of Friedrich Pfizer. Frank planned to reach Argentina. He expected help from high-ranking Catholic clergy to disappear. He saw himself as a statesman, not a criminal. He compared his future to Kaiser Wilhelm II. The Kaiser had retired in comfort to the Netherlands after the Great War. Frank expected the same. Why did he think he was untouchable? He was a lawyer. He believed legal technicalities and political status would act as armor. On May 4, 1945, the delusion shattered. American troops intercepted Frank at Neuhaus in southern Bavaria. These soldiers belonged to the division that had liberated the Dachau concentration camp 5 days earlier. They had seen the piles of bodies. They had smelled the crematoriums. Contrast defined the moment. The man who envisioned a royal retirement now stood in the dirt. The soldiers formed 2 lines. They forced Frank to walk this corridor of shame. There was no law here, only the fury of men who had seen the Holocaust. They beat him until he could no longer stand. The butcher of Poland crumbled. His arrogance vanished behind the steel bars of a cell. The pressure became absolute. He attempted suicide twice within 48 hours. After the failed noose in his cell, Frank stood before the Nuremberg tribunal. The transition from the Palatinate of Poland to a wooden dock took 18 months. He did not hide. Why did he confess when others denied everything? He found a new master in the cell. Catholic conversion turned into religious mania. Frank watched Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, testify. The cold mechanics of the gas chambers broke him. He refused to blame subordinates. The courtroom stayed silent. Prosecutors opened 38 volumes of Frank's own diaries. These pages were not private reflections. They were a logbook of liquidation. Frank had documented every order and every execution with legal precision. The prosecutor read his words aloud. The sound of turning pages filled the room. Frank listened to his own voice from the past. He had fought Jewry for years and indulged in the most horrible utterances. Now, he called for a price. He transformed from the accused into his own most effective prosecutor. He used 12,000 pages of his own handwriting to secure the conviction. October 1st, 1946, the International Military Tribunal delivered its final word. Hans Frank was found guilty of war crimes, guilty of crimes against humanity. The sentence was death by hanging. Why did Frank accept the noose so calmly? He viewed the gallows as his final altar. "I deserved it," he told his guards. "I expected it." He was the 5th man in line. The United States Army assigned Sergeant John C. Woods to carry out the sentence. Woods claimed to be an expert. He lied. The American had no professional experience with the trapdoor and the long drop. The Army trusted his word without a background check. It was a technical failure of the highest order. Preparation for the execution began in the cold hours of October 16, 1946. Frank listened to the reading of the verdict. He remained silent. 11 minutes of agony. That was the price of a technical error. On October 16, 1946, Hans Frank became the 5th man to mount the Nuremberg scaffold. He entered the chamber with a smile. It was the only smile seen that night. He spoke his final words as a plea for mercy. Then the black hood concealed his face. Sergeant John C. Woods pulled the lever. Was the cruelty of the execution intentional? Woods later claimed pride in his work, but the mechanics suggested pure incompetence. The trapdoor was too small. As Frank fell, his head struck the edge of the wooden frame. The impact caused deep, bleeding lacerations. The rope was too long. The drop lacked the force to snap the 3rd cervical vertebra. Frank did not die instantly. He hung in the darkness beneath the platform, his body jerking in the air. The narrow opening restricted his movements. He struggled for air while blood from his head wounds coated the floor. He remained conscious as his lungs failed. A standard execution takes seconds. This lasted 660 seconds. Frank convulsed in a slow strangulation for 11 minutes before his heart finally stopped. He was 46 years old. The American military took the body to a secret location. They cremated the remains. To prevent any future neo-Nazi pilgrimage, they took the ashes to the river Isar. They threw the dust into the water. The current carried the remains of the King of Poland into the darkness. The current of the Isar swallowed the ashes. But the legacy of the King of Poland did not vanish. It poisoned his bloodline. For the children of Hans Frank, the Third Reich never ended. The trauma manifested in silence, addiction, and biological decay. His wife Brigitte died in 1959. She expressed zero regret for the crimes of the regime. Their children inherited a name that felt like a death sentence. Sigrid fled to apartheid-era South Africa. She spent her final years numb, consumed by a heavy addiction to tranquilizers. His daughter Brigitte chose a different path of destruction. She could not bear to outlive the man she still loved. She committed suicide at 46. 46. The exact age of her father when the trapdoor opened in Nuremberg. The sons fared no better. Michael developed a pathological obsession with milk, consuming it in lethal quantities. He became morbidly obese and died of total organ failure at 53. Only Nicholas Frank broke the cycle of denial. In 1987, he published a book titled The Father, A Settling of Accounts. On the cover, a black line crossed out his father's face. Nicholas did not seek reconciliation. He described Hans as a slime hole and a Hitler fanatic. He publicly questioned his father's last-minute conversion to Catholicism. The world watched as a son dismantled the memory of his own flesh and blood. Nicholas Frank published the brutal truth to ensure the name would finally die. Hans Frank's story ended where his children's rebellion began. The publication of Nicholas Frank's memoirs dismantled the last remains of the family myth. No excuses, no mercy for the dead. The King of Poland became a technical case study in the banality of evil. He was not a mindless brute. He was a highly educated jurist, a man of culture, an intellectual who used the law to authorize mass murder. He quoted Goethe while signing execution orders. He played Chopin while millions burned. How does a civilized man become a monster? By degrees. By professionalizing cruelty. Frank proved that high culture is no shield against depravity. Behind the facade of a civilized authority sat a man who stole Da Vinci's Lady with an Ermine while orchestrating a genocide. The final act in Nuremberg stripped away the regalia. The majestic robes were gone. Only the uniform of a war criminal remained. The botched execution on the gallows was the ultimate mechanical failure for a man who lived by the precision of the law. History maintains no monuments for the Governor-General, no state funerals, no marked graves. The waters of the Isar River carried away the ashes of the man who thought he would rule forever. The record simply lists him as one of the most brutal war criminals brought to justice. Hans Frank died without a legacy. His name is a stain. His memory is a warning. No tears were shed.